The smell of old books hit me the moment I stepped into Eleanor's home. Her modest, ivy-covered cottage was as quaint and mysterious as the woman herself. Eleanor, my neighbor, was something of an enigma in our quiet suburb. A retired professor of literature, with a voice like soft velvet and a gaze that seemed to pierce through the surface of things. I had often wondered about her life, imagining the stories she carried with her silver hair and elegant demeanor. It was a surprise when she invited me over. "I thought you might appreciate my library," she had said earlier that week, her eyes crinkling with a gentle smile. Not many people these days seem to care about books, let alone the kind that whisper stories of the past. I didn't hesitate to accept. As an aspiring writer struggling to find inspiration, I couldn't resist the allure of her words. That evening, as I crossed the threshold into her world, I felt like I was stepping into another era. The library was the heart of her home, a sunlit room with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with leather-bound tomes, ancient manuscripts, and artifacts that seemed plucked from a Victorian parlor. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, mixing with the musk of aged paper. The dim, golden light from an antique lamp cast long shadows, giving the room an almost sacred atmosphere. "This is incredible," I murmured, running my fingers along the spine of a weathered book titled Memoirs of an Eccentric Mind. Eleanor watched me with a look of quiet amusement. "It's been my sanctuary for decades, a place where time slows down and the world's chaos fades." Her voice had a soothing rhythm, like the gentle turn of pages. She gestured to a leather armchair by the window. "Sit, please. I'll make us some tea." As she disappeared into the kitchen, I let myself sink into the chair, feeling its warm leather hug me like an old friend. A soft rain began to patter against the window, amplifying the sense of intimacy in the room. It was as though the world outside had been sealed off, leaving only this cocoon of stories and secrets. When Eleanor returned, she carried a tray with 2 cups of tea and a small plate of shortbread cookies. She placed it on the low table between us and took the chair opposite mine. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, as if she were performing a quiet ritual. "I hope you don't mind Earl Grey," she said, handing me a delicate porcelain cup. "Not at all," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. "This room is amazing. It feels alive." Her eyes lit up at my words. "That's exactly how I think of it. These books have souls, each carrying the essence of their time and the hands that held them. They've been my companions in solitude." We talked for hours, our conversation flowing seamlessly from literature to philosophy to life's small, profound mysteries. She shared stories of her youth, of travels to faraway places, and of a love lost too soon. I found myself captivated, not just by her words, but by the way she spoke, with a kind of wistful passion that made the past feel alive. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same book. The brief contact sent a spark through me, unexpected and disarming. Eleanor pulled back with a small smile, but her eyes lingered on mine a moment longer than necessary. The air in the room shifted, charged with something unspoken. I felt it, a quiet pull, like the magnetic force between 2 opposite poles. It was as if the library itself had become a conduit for something neither of us could name. I tried to shake off the moment, focusing instead on the open book in my hands. It was an old leather-bound volume with intricate gold lettering, its pages yellowed with age. The words swam before my eyes, though, as my thoughts remained tethered to Eleanor. Her presence was magnetic, her elegance radiating a quiet strength that both intrigued and unsettled me. I turned the page mechanically, not absorbing a single word. Eleanor seemed to sense my distraction. "You've gone quiet," she remarked softly, her voice breaking the silence like a gentle breeze. Are you lost in thought, or is my library overwhelming? Her words brought a faint smile to my lips. A little of both, I think. It's hard not to feel small in a room like this. Every book seems to carry a lifetime within its pages. She leaned forward slightly, her silver hair catching the lamplight. And what about you? What lifetime do you carry within you? The question caught me off guard. There was no teasing in her tone, only genuine curiosity. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. I'm not sure I've lived enough to carry much of anything yet, I admitted. I feel like I'm still figuring it out. Eleanor studied me for a moment, her gaze both piercing and tender. You underestimate yourself. Even the young carry stories, whether they realize it or not. Didn't know how to respond to that. Her words felt like a challenge and a comfort all at once. I looked down at the book in my lap, pretending to read, but my mind was racing. There was something about Eleanor that unsettled me, not in an unpleasant way, but in a way that stirred emotions I wasn't ready to name. As the evening wore on, the conversation resumed its natural flow. We discussed favorite authors, debated the merits of certain literary styles, and even laughed over an old anecdote she shared about a disastrous poetry reading she once attended. Yet, beneath the surface, the unspoken tension remained, like an undercurrent in an otherwise calm sea. At one point, she rose from her chair and moved to a nearby shelf, her fingers trailing along the spines of the books as if searching for something. The motion was unhurried, almost hypnotic. I watched her, captivated by the way she carried herself. Graceful, deliberate, as though every movement held meaning. She pulled out a book and turned back to me, holding it out with a small smile. "This one might interest you," she said, her voice tinged with warmth. "It's a collection of letters from a poet to his muse. I think you'll find it inspiring." I reached for the book, our hands brushing once more. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. Her fingers lingered on mine, the touch both electrifying and comforting. My pulse quickened, and I felt a warmth rise in my chest. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice barely audible. She withdrew her hand slowly, her smile soft but unreadable. "You're welcome." For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us, the library fading into the background. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I opened the book, pretending to read, as my thoughts swirled in a chaotic tangle. Eleanor returned to her seat, and we sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the faint patter of rain against the windows. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, the weight of which seemed to press down on me. Eventually she broke the silence. "You remind me of someone I once knew," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "A young man I met when I was your age. He was curious, passionate, full of potential. Much like you." I looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. "What caused you to stop me?" What happened to him?" Her eyes grew distant, a faint sadness flickering in their depths. "Life happened, as it often does. We lost touch, and I suppose I never quite stopped wondering what might have been." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to ask more, to delve into the story she seemed hesitant to share, but I sensed that some things were better left unsaid. As the evening wore on, the rain outside turned into a steady downpour, the sound soothing in its constancy. Eleanor offered to refill my tea, and I followed her into the kitchen, drawn by a need to prolong our time together. The kitchen was small but cozy, its shelves lined with jars of spices and dried herbs. She moved with practiced ease, her every action imbued with a quiet grace. As she poured the tea, I found myself watching her hands, the way they moved, steady and sure yet delicate. You're staring, she said, without looking up, a hint of amusement in her voice. I flushed, caught off guard. Sorry, I was just lost in thought. She glanced at me then, her eyes sparkling with a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite name. You seem to get lost in thought a lot. I wonder what it is you're thinking about. Her words felt like a challenge, and for a moment I considered answering honestly, but the truth felt too complicated, too raw to put into words. Just the books, I said finally, hoping she wouldn't press further. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze lingering on me for a moment before she turned back to the teapot. Books have a way of doing that, she said softly, almost to herself. They reveal things about us we didn't even know we were hiding. The weight of her words settled over me, and I felt a sudden urge to step closer, to bridge the space between us, but I held back, unsure of what I was feeling or why. We returned to the library, the tea in our hands a comforting anchor. As the evening deepened into night, the conversation grew quieter, more reflective. Eleanor spoke of her travels, of the places she had seen and the people she had met, her voice weaving a tapestry of memories that seemed to fill the room. I listened intently, drawn not just to her stories, but to the way she told them. Her voice a melody that resonated deep within me. It was as if she were inviting me into her world, sharing a part of herself that few had seen. The hours slipped away unnoticed until finally the grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight. Eleanor looked at me, her expression soft but tired. It's late, she said, her voice tinged with reluctance. You should probably get going. I nodded, though part of me didn't want to leave. Thank you for tonight, I said sincerely. This was incredible. She smiled, a warmth in her eyes that made my chest tighten. The pleasure was mine. You're welcome anytime. As I stepped out into the rain-soaked night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The connection I felt with Eleanor was unlike anything I had experienced before. Deep, complex, and impossible to ignore. I knew as I walked home that this was only the beginning. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time I reached my door, but my thoughts were anything but calm. Eleanor's voice, her stories, her touch, all of it lingered in my mind like the final notes of a haunting melody. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling as the moments in her library replayed themselves over and over. Her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of something she loved, the delicate brush of her fingers against mine, all of it wove itself into a tapestry of emotion I couldn't unravel. I told myself it was just admiration, a kind of reverence for her intellect and poise, but I couldn't deny that it felt like more. There was a pull between us, subtle but undeniable, like the quiet tug of a tide that carries you out to sea before you realize you are adrift. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would bring clarity, but instead it brought dreams of Eleanor. In those dreams, I hoped there was a dream, holding out a book I couldn't quite reach. Her smile was knowing, her gaze steady, and I woke with my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I tried to focus on my usual routine, but everything felt muted, as if the color had been drained from the world outside of Eleanor's library. My coffee tasted bitter, the news droned on without meaning, and even the familiar hum of the city outside my window felt distant. I found myself glancing at the clock repeatedly, wondering if it would be too forward to stop by her house unannounced. I told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, she had her own life, her own routines, and I couldn't expect her to drop everything for a neighbor half her age. Still, the pull was there, insistent and unrelenting. By early afternoon, I had convinced myself that it would be rude not to thank her properly for the evening before. I grabbed a small bouquet of flowers from a street vendor. A modest gesture, I told myself, nothing more, and made my way to her house. The walk felt longer than it had the night before, every step laden with anticipation. When I finally reached her door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the brass knocker. Before I could overthink it, the door opened and there she was, her expression shifting from surprise to delight in an instant. She was dressed casually in a cream-colored sweater and jeans, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders in soft waves. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise," she said, her voice warm. "To what do I owe the honor?" I held out the flowers, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I just wanted to thank you for last night. It meant a lot to me." Her smile deepened, and she stepped aside to let me in. "You're too kind. Come in, come in. I was just about to make some tea." I followed her into the kitchen, the now familiar scents of lavender and aged paper wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. She took the flowers with a soft "thank you," placing them in a crystal vase on the windowsill before turning her attention to the kettle. As she moved, I found myself noticing the small details. The way her hair caught the light, the faint laugh lines that softened her face, the quiet confidence in her movements. She was beautiful in a way that felt timeless, unburdened by the expectations of youth. We settled in the library once more, the rain starting up again outside, as if the universe itself conspired to create the perfect backdrop. The conversation flowed easily, as it had the night before, but there was a new intimacy to it, a sense of familiarity that hadn't been there before. She asked about my writing, and I confessed to my struggles, my fear that I didn't have anything worth saying. She listened with a kind of attentiveness that made me feel seen in a way that I hadn't experienced before. "Every writer feels that way," she said after a moment, her voice thoughtful. "The trick is to trust that your voice matters, even if it's only to one person. Sometimes that's enough." Her words settled over me like a balm, soothing the doubts I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "Has anyone ever told you how incredible you are?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She laughed softly, a sound like the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze. "Once or twice," she said, her eyes sparkling, "but it's always nice to hear." The rain grew heavier, the sound filling the silence that followed. I wanted to say more, to tell her how much she had come to mean to me in such a short time, but the words felt too big, too overwhelming. Instead, I reached for the book she had given me the night before, thumbing through its pages as I tried to steady my thoughts. She watched me quietly, her expression unreadable. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, setting the book aside. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "What is it you see when you look at me?" The question caught me off guard, but I didn't shy away from it. "I see someone who's brilliant and kind, someone who's lived a life full of stories I can only dream of, someone who makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt before." Her eyes searched mine, and I could see the vulnerability there, the quiet fear of being truly seen. "And does that scare you?" "Yes," I admitted, "but it also feels inevitable." Ugh. The room seemed to hold its breath as she set her teacup down and leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "Inevitable," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the word. "That's an interesting choice. I'm not sure how else to describe it," I said. "It's like there's a current pulling us together, and no matter how hard I try to fight it, it only gets stronger." Her lips curved into a small, wistful smile. "You have a way with words, you know." I shrugged, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "I'm just trying to be honest." She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap. Then let me be honest, too. I feel it too, the pull, the inevitability. It's been a long time since I've felt anything like this, and it scares me too. But it also makes me feel alive. Her words hung between us, the air thick with unspoken possibilities. I wanted to reach for her hand, to close the distance that felt both impossibly wide and achingly close. But I held back, unsure of what would happen if I did. Instead, I met her gaze, my voice barely above a whisper. What do we do now? She didn't answer right away, her eyes searching mine, as if looking for something she couldn't quite name. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but soft. We take it one moment at a time. And in that moment, it felt like the library itself exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave. We sat there, the rain outside a quiet rhythm that matched the beating of my heart, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The days that followed felt surreal, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate the gravity of what was unfolding. I found myself drawn to Eleanor's home more frequently, under the pretense of borrowing books or discussing literary themes. Each visit seemed to deepen the connection between us, the conversations growing richer. On one particularly overcast afternoon, I arrived at her door to find her waiting for me. She didn't seem surprised to see me, as though she had anticipated my arrival. She was dressed in a flowing burgundy sweater that brought warmth to her pale complexion, her silver hair loosely tied back. She smiled, a gesture that felt like an invitation. I was just about to organize the library, she said, stepping aside to let me in. Care to join me? I nodded, my heart pounding as I stepped into the now familiar space. The library was bathed in a soft, diffused light from the gray sky outside, lending it an almost ethereal quality. The air was fragrant with the scent of old paper and the faint traces of lavender that seemed to cling to Eleanor wherever she went. She handed me a small stack of books to shelve, and we worked side by side, the silence between us companionable. I found myself sneaking glances at her, captivated by the way she moved, the gentle precision of her hands, the way her eyes lingered on each title, as if greeting an old friend. Have you ever thought about writing your own story? I asked suddenly, the question surprising even me. She paused, her fingers resting on the spine of a book. I've thought about it, she admitted, but I'm not sure where I'd begin. My life doesn't feel like a story. It feels more like a collection of moments, some meaningful, some fleeting. Maybe that's all a story is, I said, a collection of moments that mean something to someone. She turned to look at me, her expression thoughtful. And what about you? What story are you writing? I hesitated, the weight of her gaze making it hard to speak. I'm not sure yet, but I think you might be part of it. Asperger syndrome. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the tension building like a string pulled taut. She reached out then, her fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through me. You have a way of seeing people, she said softly. It's a rare gift. I swallowed hard, the intensity of her gaze making it difficult to breathe. Maybe it's because you make it easy to see you. Her lips curved into a small, wistful smile. You have no idea how long it's been since someone said something like that to me. Before I could respond, a book slipped from my hands, the sound of it hitting the floor breaking the spell. I bent down to pick it up, but when I straightened, I found her standing closer than before. Her hand brushed mine as she took the book, and neither of us pulled away. The moment stretched, the tension between us almost unbearable. I could feel the warmth of her breath, see the faint lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled. Her gaze flickered to my lips, and I felt my resolve slipping, the pull between us too strong to resist. I shouldn't, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should stop pretending we don't feel this, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Her eyes searched mine, a mixture of fear and longing in their depths. This is dangerous, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Instead, my hand met her warmth, and my mouth dropped open. Sometimes the most meaningful things are, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to summon the strength to pull away, but when she opened them, her resolve seemed to crumble. One moment, she said, her voice trembling. Just one, and then she kissed me. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as her lips met mine, soft and warm and impossibly real. The kiss was tentative at first, as though testing the waters, but it quickly deepened, the unspoken tension of the past weeks finally breaking free. Her hands found their way to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I let myself sink into the moment, every doubt and hesitation melting away. Time lost all meaning as we stood there, surrounded by the weight of countless stories, our own unfolding in the most unexpected of ways. When we finally broke apart, her cheeks were flushed, her breathing uneven. She looked at me with a mixture of wonder and fear, as though she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. This changes everything, she said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my own thoughts too scattered to form coherent words. I know, for a long moment, we simply stood there, the weight of what we had done settling over us. The library felt different now, as though it had borne witness to something sacred and irrevocable. I wanted to say something to reassure her, to let her know that she wasn't alone in this, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, she stepped back, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. We can't pretend this didn't happen, she said, but we need to figure out what it means. I reached for her hand, holding it gently. Whatever it means, we'll face it together. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. Promise me something, she said. No matter what happens, you won't regret this. I could never regret you. I said, my voice steady, her lips trembled, and she gave a small nod. Then let's take it one moment at a time. And so we began. Each moment felt like a delicate balancing act, the weight of our connection tempered by the reality of the world outside. But for now, in the sanctuary of her library, the world felt far away, and we allowed ourselves to exist in the fragile, beautiful space we had created. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Eleanor and I existed in a fragile bubble, careful not to disturb the delicate balance we'd found. Our connection deepened with every glance we'd found, every touch, every word exchanged in the quiet sanctity of her home library. Yet, the weight of what we were doing loomed over us like a shadow, a constant reminder that the world beyond her ivy-covered walls would not be so forgiving. One evening, as the autumn sun dipped below the horizon, casting the library in hues of gold and amber, Eleanor sat across from me, her expression pensive. She held a book in her lap, but her fingers rested idly on the cover, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. I watched her, captivated by the interplay of light and shadow on her face, the way her silver hair caught the fading sunlight. I've been thinking, she began softly. her voice carrying an uncharacteristic heaviness. Her gaze lingered on every singe, and on every inch. I set my own book aside, leaning forward. About what? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. About what we're doing. About where this leads. Her words sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Do you regret it? I asked, the question hanging in the air like a fragile thread. She looked up then, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of tenderness and sorrow. No, she said firmly. I could never regret you. But I can't ignore the reality of our situation. The world won't understand, and I'm not sure I can bear the weight of its judgment. Her honesty cut through me, leaving an ache in its wake. I don't care about the world, I said, my voice filled with conviction. All I care about is you. She smiled faintly, the corners of her lips trembling. You're young, full of passion and certainty, but life has taught me that love, no matter how profound, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by the world around it, by expectations and consequences. I reached for her hand, my fingers closing around hers. Then let's create our own world, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. A world where we don't have to hide, where we can just be. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment I thought she might agree. But then she shook her head, her expression resolute. It's not that simple. The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of her words settling between us like a physical presence. I wanted to argue, to convince her that what we had was worth fighting for, but the sadness in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't rejecting me. She was protecting me, and perhaps herself from the pain she believed was inevitable. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between us grew. We still saw each other, still talked and laughed and shared moments of quiet intimacy. But there was a restraint to her now, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. I could feel her pulling away, even as she tried to hide it. One night, as I sat in the library, waiting for her to return with tea, I noticed a letter resting on the small table by her chair. My name was written on the envelope in her elegant handwriting. My heart sank as I reached for it, a sense of foreboding washing over me. The letter was short, but its words carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. My dearest, these past weeks with you have been some of the most beautiful of my life. You've reminded me of what it feels like to truly live, to feel deeply and without reservation. But I fear that in loving you, I've been selfish. I've asked too much of you, of myself, and I can't bear the thought of you suffering because of me. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I must let you go. Not because I want to, but because I love you too much to keep you in a situation that can only bring heartache. You deserve a life unburdened by secrets and shadows. You deserve to write your own story, free from the constraints of mine. Please know that this decision doesn't come lightly. My heart will always carry the memory of you, of us, and I will cherish it for the rest of my days. Yours, always. Eleanor. I sat there for what felt like hours, the letter trembling in my hands. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, the ache in my chest threatening to consume me. I wanted to run to her, to tell her that we could make it work, that I didn't care about the risks or the judgment. But deep down, I knew she wouldn't listen. Her mind was made up, her resolve unshakable. The next day, I found her house empty. The library, once filled with warmth and life, felt hollow without her presence. I searched for her, hoping for some sign that she hadn't truly left, but there was nothing. Only the faint scent of lavender lingered, a ghost of her that refused to fade. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on, but the memory of Eleanor haunted me. Every book I read, every rainy afternoon, every quiet moment brought her back to me. I found myself returning to her house, sitting on the porch steps and staring at the door, as if willing her to walk through it. She never did. But the story she had given me, the story of us, remained. It shaped me, changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. And though it ended far too soon, it left a mark on my heart that would never fade.